Good morning, biologists. This is Miss R, and we're ready to rock and roll for the Unit 3 test review. Let's talk about some of the big ideas here. We're going to talk about the muscular systems of a flatworm and a human, well, mostly a human. Explain the relationships between bone and muscle with regards to movement, think myosin and actin, as well as different parts of muscles. Describe the cellular and molecular basis of muscle contractions. Again, think myosin and actin as well as ATP. Understands the basics of plant sexual and asexual reproduction. We're going to interpret the diagram of a life cycle of a flowering plant and also understand the basics of human reproduction. They kind of have some fundamental similarities. We're going to interpret the diagram of the life cycle of a human and state the role of antibodies in the body's response to infection. And we'll cover some other big ideas too. Immune system response, bacteria and viruses, and our primary defenses against them, as well as how a compromised immune system may be unable to respond to common infections. That's what happens when you contract HIV. So let's talk about fern life cycles. Ferns are a little bit different than flowering plants in that they have a stage of their life cycle that's 1N. This is a real plant that will grow, and you'll see it. It looks different than a regular fern here, and it's only got 1N, one copy of each chromosome, which is different than us. We always have 2N except for our sex cells. But this is an organism, an adult organism, that's part of the life cycle that's only 1N. Then it produces sex cells, fertilizes, and turns into a 2N. That's a sporophyte. This is a gametophyte, this is a sporophyte. Gametophyte is 1N, sporophyte is 2N. So if you guessed A here, the life cycle goes 1N to 2N to 1N, you're correct. The 1N, remember, is haploid. Haploid sounds like half. Half what would normally be present in an organism that you're more familiar with. 2N is diploid, like diverse or has more diversity. Or diverge. They're like two roads in a wood and they diverged. That means they it split into two. So diploid has two copies. All right, this is a practice essay question, and it asks you really about the structure and function of muscles. Here's the molecular view of muscles. You don't need to know these I zones, H zones. You need to know about myosin, that's the red stuff in the middle, and actin, that's the blue stuff here in this diagram. And the myosin kind of creeps along the actin, kind of jumping along, powered by ATP. We'll look at a better diagram in a minute. And these muscle strands are organized, these muscle cells are organized into muscle fibers, and those fibers are organized into fascicles, and those fascicles are organized into muscles, which are attached to bones by tendons. All of this relates to the function of muscles. This is the structure, and it relates to the function of muscles, which is to move our bones around and help us get around. So you want to be able to explain how to build a muscle using the appropriate words for all of the parts. And if you need to go back into the lesson, that's a good idea. Let's talk a little bit about one of the practice essay questions here. What happens between egg and a baby? Remember that eggs start out in the ovary, they travel into the fallopian tube, they get fertilized by sperm, and then they move into the uterus. A placenta forms to nourish the embryo and eventually the fetus. So know that whole story about how you developed if you want to do well on the essay questions. Another practice essay question is HIV infects the what system? The human immunodeficiency virus attacks the immune system. People with AIDS, That's acquired immune deficiency syndrome. People who have the HIV virus and develop low T cells get unusual diseases because here's what happens to their T cells over time. You can see this is the T lymphocyte count. The T lymphocytes help your cells attack foreign invaders. And if you don't have those cells, you don't have much of an immune system. And quickly you can get unusual diseases other people with healthy immune systems don't get. Okay, eggs develop in the ovule of flowering plants. You need to know where that is. The ovule right here is inside the main part of the stem here. It's just on top of the stem. It's an ovary, just like in humans, but in kind of a different place and made out of slightly different stuff. The anthers here are the male part of the flower. They produce male sex cells. And those male sex cells typically won't get into the same plant. They blow away or get taken away by a bee in this case, and go to another plant. Hopefully a bee brings in pollen from another plant, and that fertilizes this one so they can do sexual reproduction with different genes from a different organism. And then this develops into seeds and maybe even fruit to give the seeds, animals, a reason to take the seeds different places. If you guessed the lower part of the flower near the stem, you are absolutely correct. Remember, eggs develop in the ovule of flowering plants. They're basically like the eggs in humans that develop in the ovary. Ovule sounds a lot like ovary, and it's right here in the flower. How can you help plants reproduce asexually? Well, here's an example of an asexually reproducing plant here. Here's a strawberry, and it's producing runners that produce other strawberry plants. This is an example of asexual reproduction. Your grass does this very well. So if you allow runners to grow, or you plant bulbs, such as onions are bulbs, or tulips, or garlic, those are ways that plants reproduce asexually, and you can reproduce those plants quite easily by planting the bulbs. A bone needs a pair of muscles to move back and forth. What is this pair called? Well, let's go through the possible answers. Origin and insertion are the places where the muscle attaches, so that's not a good option. Radius and ulna, those are two bones. Right and left, those aren't muscles. Flexor and extensors are a pair of muscles that move your bones. And if you didn't know, you better choose E. You'll be reviewing for the test. Flexion is bringing a limb towards your body like this. I'm using my flexors now. And now I'm using my extensors, bringing my limb away from my body. Myosin heads attach to the actin and pull along the actin. Where does this take place in the body? Excuse me. We looked at this type of cell earlier, and we know that it is a muscle cell. So if you guessed muscles contracting, that's exactly true. Here's a muscle movement that's flexing, shortening this muscle right here, and that draws in your forearm. There are other ways that muscles contract, but we're not going to talk about those right now. Here's a good drawing of a muscle relaxed, and here's one contracted. The myosin here, this red stuff, kind of creeps along the actin and kind of squishes it together. So you can see that the space right here in the middle kind of disappears as the myosin kind of crunches the actin in. And the myosin heads bind to ATP, and then they stick to the actin, and they kind of cock. They kind of click over like this, and that's what actually moves the muscle. Muscles are made of proteins. Myosin and actin are two very important proteins, and there are a number of other important proteins in muscles, but if you guessed myosin and actin, you're going to do pretty well on the test. Placenta is the connection between mother and fetus. Why doesn't the blood between the mother and fetus mix? Well, we skipped right down to the answer. The mother's immune system might act against the baby. You don't want your mother's immune system to attack the baby, so their two different blood systems don't mix. The placenta brings the blood close together, but the blood doesn't actually mix up because the baby might have a different blood type than the mother. Fertilization takes place here in the fallopian tubes. This is where sperm meets egg. So the fallopian tubes are here between the ovaries and the uterus. So they're the journey of the egg between the ovaries here and the uterus here. Fallopian tubes are right here. That's where the egg is fertilized. Antibodies attach to a virus to cue other cells to destroy it. Antibodies don't actually destroy a cell in itself. A lot of people have struggled with that idea. Antibodies are just tags. They're like a big sign your body smacks on a foreign invader going, "Destroy me," and then other cells come along and munch it down. Antibodies are made in B cells. Remember, T cells help the B cells, but antibodies here, this thing that has kind of changeable Lego parts right here, are made in B cells. Here's a naive B cell that hasn't met a pathogen yet, hasn't seen the antigen, the marker on the pathogen says, hey, this is not part of the body, attack this. And then eventually it will turn into a memory B cell for a specific virus. So B cells are your friend. They make antibodies and they help your body remember that you've seen this cold virus or the chicken pox or something before and help you eliminate it before you get sick. Macrophages surround pathogens and destroy them. Macrophages are particularly awesome because they're your first line of defense against pathogens. They find the pathogen and they suck it in and they destroy it. They digest the pathogens and they kill them. So all the nasty bad things that get into your body, the macrophages are your first line of defense. Then later antibodies will attach to it and other cells will come into play. Here's phagocytosis, that's eating cells. Here's what your macrophages do. A particle comes in, the receptors on the outside of the macrophage recognize this as, hey, this is a yucky thing, this is a pathogen, we don't want it in our body. It kind of sucks it in and then it digests it using enzymes and acids. HIV attacks your T cells. Which statement is true after someone has HIV for a few years? Does their T cell count increase, decrease, or is it about their B cells? Their T cell count decreases over time. Here's the blue line. Their T cell goes down, and that weakens their immune system. Antibiotics won't cure a cold because antibiotics work on bacteria. Viruses you can't kill because they're not alive. Colds are caused by viruses, which is why if you take antibiotics for a cold, that's just kind of silly. It's not going to do any good. Viruses are particularly scary to humans because viruses come into our cell, take over the ribosomes, and force the cell to make more viruses. So they come into our bodies and force our bodies to make more of themselves, which is particularly scary because they're really good. They can take over our bodies very quickly if our immune systems are weakened and aren't there to attack them and make antibodies. Rheumatoid arthritis is a debilitating immune disease. What goes wrong with our immune system?